This is going to be your guide to using Flutter Mane in Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. So I wanted to jump to the Paradox Pokemon even though they aren't usable in the first season of the Ranked Battle Stadium because they are very relevant and have some crazy things to talk about. So if you enjoy the video or if it helps out in any way, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and comment your thoughts down below. So yeah, it's like a Mega Pokemon with more optimized stats, and then it can use an item, and it also gets an exclusive item that does crazy stuff. Yeah, it's time to start studying up and learning about these things before they become usable in Ranked. So 135 special attack, 135 speed. This is really just like reserved for legendary Pokemon or some kind of crazy gimmick or also Mega Evolutions and stuff. And that brings me back to the day when you look at an old Pokemon like Weavile back in Generation 4, how you gonna beat it? 120 attack, that's pretty high, but a 125 speed, what is going to outspeed it? And then now modern Pokemon is looking pretty crazy. However, this does not mean that Flutter Mane is free, so we have a lot of extracurriculars to go into. Starting off with speed tiers. So this is from like the Google Doc that was documenting all the leaked information. It's not perfect because it isn't level 50 and it's kind of missing a few Pokemon, but it kind of gives you an idea of where we are. So Flutter Mane, without any adjustments, you know, +1 Scarf, Speed Boost, whatever, it's going to be at 49th out of the decks with a positive nature. This is also going to tie it with Chien-Pao, and Iron Bundle is going to outspeed it. So we're going to talk about other Paradox, future, and past forms and stuff. So the idea here is it shows what you need to do to make Flutter Mane untouchably fast, or the threats you need to look out for as they're setting up against your Flutter Mane. So we have something like Dragapult with a neutral nature +1, so like Modest Scarf or something like that. You actually clear it by a pretty large margin. We have Baxcalibur at +2 with a positive nature. So 2 Dragon Dances just loses to the Timid Scarf or Timid Booster Energy. Those are going to be things to keep in mind for the matchups. We also have the typing of Flutter Mane. Now you hear Ghost Fairy and you think, yeah, that sounds like it's going to be pretty good. But when you actually look at it, that's outrageous. 3 immunities. I mean, we know this because Ghost Fairy, normal, fighting dragon, you don't really resist anything, but only 2 weaknesses. You only have to worry about Steel, and you only have to worry about Ghost. Now, Steel, pretty common because fairies are a large threat. Ghost, kind of seeing it, maybe seeing a bit more with like some shenanigans going on with Generation 9 meta. Now, this typing gives Flutter Mane the very rare trait of being a sweeper that you can reliably switch into that also backs up your tank Pokemon. Normally, it's the other way around. Your tank backs up your sweeper, but with this, if you have a Steel-type Pokemon or a Normal-type Pokemon that's trying to be bulky, trying to set up, trying to tank up, well, you can just go into Flutter Mane and be immune to the fighting, while also helping out a Dragon-type Pokemon that might want to go for Dragon Dance or Sweep in its own way. So Flutter Mane gives you the stats, but it also gives you a lot more options for team building that makes things kind of interesting. So as a Ghost-type Pokemon with 135 special defense, what can you survive? So we have Dragapult with Life Orb. It's kind of one of the only relevant damage calculations because it's one of the only Pokemon that can actually outspeed you. So it's going to be Speedy Nature, Shadow Ball, Life Orb, and you survive most of the time. So it actually isn't just like guaranteed survival, which is interesting to think about. And I wanted to see where the options went because of course a Moonblast into the Dragapult is going to be a KO, and looking at the damage, that means a Shadow Ball is also going to be a KO. So what about the Draining Kiss? Like, is there tech on super effective hits? No, you eat all this damage from the Dragapult, and then how much do you heal up? You actually heal like 70% of your health from almost one-shotting it because it's super hit. Very interesting. And then we can take this a step further when we go into speed shenanigans. So level 50, that's the flat rules, and that is what you want to be calculating speed on because you can actually get different matchups at level 100 depending on like EVs and boosting compared to when it actually goes down to level 50. So some funkiness right there, but it shows like if we have a Modest Nature or an Adamant Nature or a Neutral Nature speed, but a Scarf on Dragapult, these are the EVs you want, which also frees up 76 EVs in the hit points, and then that means very low chance to get KO'd by the Dragapult. Now, depending on where this matchup goes, Dragapult isn't a good Pokemon, so I don't think the meta is going to get weird enough to where you need to shave off the 1 damage in special attack EVs to put it into the hit points, so that way you don't just randomly lose 6% of your games. So that's not really going to happen, but wanted to kind of give you guys the considerations for how these matchups can evolve and how you can get the most stats out of your Flutter Mane. As for a physically attacking Dragapult, so we have 120 attack, low base power, non-stab, hitting into a 55-55. Yes, Steel Wing KOs from the Dragapult. Now, it needs to have like 252 attack investment, but a Jolly Dragapult will be able to get away with this, and there's not really anything you can do about it. Now, the other problem you face when you're dealing with, like, weird speed stuff is that there's going to be other Flutter Manes at +1, and then other Pokemon in the same speed tier, like Chien-Pao. So you don't want to just get outscarfed by a Jolly Chien-Pao, which would also be kind of wacky, but you don't want to, like, get into that and then have a very bad time. So it kind of depends on where the speed ramping is going, and that gets even harder to predict with Generation 9, because it seems like we're in a very bulky kind of metagame. With Gholdengo, with Garganasalt, seems like it's not really worth bringing a sweeping Pokemon, because you can just get bulked out on a fast, low-hitting Pokemon set up against, and then you lose the game. Breloom is back in the game because nothing is reliably outspeeding the Breloom. It's weird times, and we're going to see how that evolves as Flutter Mane and other Pokemon are allowed in as the ranked seasons develop. So now we can actually talk about the moveset. Like, we need to set all of this up on the Flutter Mane before we actually break down what you want to do on this Pokemon. So, Booster Energy activates Photosynthesis or Quark Drive abilities, single use. And then these are going to be exclusives to the Paradox Pokemon. You're probably familiar. If you aren't, while Sunny Day is active, the highest stat gets 1.3x if it's a non-speed stat, or it effectively becomes, you know, free +1 if you get speed. So what this means is that you also have other avenues of building a team. You can just run a raw 135 Pokemon as some kind of core sweeper to either clean up the late game or kind of hold down the rest of your team composition, or you can have a sacrifice Torkoal lead with Heat Rock, any kind of Sunny Day setting Pokemon, combo this with other Pokemon that have the Photosynthesis ability, and then build a team around it, or you can just activate it on the Booster Energy. Booster Energy is single use, so keep that in mind. Like, you can't just throw the Flutter Mane out there, get your crazy Photosynthesis, and then, oh man, they have a counter to me, so then I switch out and come back in. You only get the Booster Energy once, so you need to make the most out of it. And that's when we start getting into the stats. Now, this goes into something I find very interesting that isn't very common, but if the opportunity arises, it gets really cool, and that's defensive boosting on sweeping Pokemon. So you outspeed, you drop some kind of defensive boosting move, and now you're just taking 30% less damage. Calm Mind gives special attack, which is also very important, but now if you're going up against a special attacker, you outspeed them, you Calm Mind, they do less damage, and then you're just able to set up even harder or start going for the sweep. So the idea is, you run the Booster Energy, you make sure it's synergizing with the highest stat that you want to boost, and then now you're just like one of the fastest Pokemon in the game possible. That we have the Flutter Mane with a Scarf, or at +1, and that's going to be beaten out by very few things, and you need to start finding like Unburdens and +2s and +3s. So yeah, Flutter Mane going to be close to untouchable at that point. And when you do that, now you just Calm Mind. So you have +1 special attack, +1 speed, no choice restrictions on a 135. So what do you do with that power? Moonblast, 95. Moonblast is one of those really cheeky moves because we saw nerfs to like the core special attacking moves back in the day, where Thunderbolt, Ice Beam, Flamethrower going from 95 down to 90, just removing a little bit of power from the game, but then Moonblast holding that. So whenever you find a stab Moonblast, it feels good. We also have Shadow Ball for the coverage, also gaining stab, and then you just want to use your last move to find extra bits of coverage. So Thunderbolt, it's mostly for something like a Toxapex. What are you going to do to a Toxapex? Not much. What are you going to do to Bulky Water? You want to hit it super. Going through the other moves, it's hard to find something that kind of beats this out. So we have Energy Ball. Well, Thunderbolt's already hitting waters and then can also cover for Toxapex, where the poison on Toxapex makes the Energy Ball a neutral hit that doesn't really do anything. So Shadow Ball's just better than the Energy Ball. And that really only leaves Psyshock for Blissey and dedicated special defense tanks. If you're in a Calm Mind mirror match, you want to be able to Psyshock through that. Or if you're going up against something that's just hard tanking you like the Blissey, you want to be able to respond to it. The other item options get weird on this Pokemon though, because okay, you have something like the Focus Sash, and that's really only there to protect you against physical attackers, like Scizor outspeeding you on a Bullet Punch, but because your coverage doesn't immediately destroy the Scizor, unless you're running Mystical Fire, but then you're giving up something important, like okay, you run the Mystical Fire instead of the Psyshock, so now Blissey bodies you instead of Scizor. Is that what you want? Also, Terra Scizor could like remove its 4x weakness. Things start breaking down and getting funky, but overall the idea is on the Focus Sash, like, you hit something and you get to do something. So if it's a weakened Scizor, if it's a super effective hit on a bulky physical Pokemon, because even at like +0 or +1, some bulky physical attackers just survive. They tag you with anything, and then you get KO'd. So the Focus Sash means like, I'm hitting something twice, and on the 135, that means I win. So the idea being that Flutter Mane just brings so much to your team that it's going to be your booster energy slot, unless you have some kind of other crazy gimmick you want to cook up, so it gets the priority for those items, or something like the Focus Sash. After that, I've got this. I think you go for the bulky Flutter Mane, and that can also be very good, because the +1 and having to get into like boost energy and boosting speed, that really only matters if you're going into the highest of most insane speed tiers of Pokemon. And like I said, the meta's kind of slowing down, so depending on like what else is trying to get +1s and outspeed you, you could just go for the raw power. And that's where things get even weirder. So if we change that Dragapult to Choice Specs and throw down the Shadow Ball, at 252 hit points, we survive. So that's kind of weird. Now we're losing the special attack, and then we have to like find a way of getting some of those stats back, but not like you have an opponent that's locked into a spec Shadow Ball Dragapult, which is one of the easiest to set up things in the game. So they're kind of really thrown right there. And then you get like all the reads on Choice Specs, a move that can be immune or easily responded to. That's just the weirdness of Pokemon. Anything can happen, and if you lose, it's probably to like the 5% niche, never seen before weird item pick or EV spread or moveset or something. So those things will just happen. But I mean, if you just kind of run this, you're kind of set up against a lot. And then you're wondering, but doesn't that mean it takes away from the special attack? So aren't you going to be hitting less? And when you actually look at the math, not really. So EVs, we know how they work. You get a set amount of stats. Going from 155 to 187 isn't a huge jump. And even though Calm Mind is also going to be giving you 50% of that difference right here, it still doesn't really amount to too much. So the difference between a +1 252 EV special attack Flutter Mane and a +1 uninvested Flutter Mane is only about 25% damage. So the idea being, with a healing item and then more hit point investment, you're able to find that extra Calm Mind that's going to convert into more damage, and then more sustain, and then more healing. And also, I think this is a better way of investing your Terra type on the Flutter Mane, that if you're running this Ghost or Fairy or whatever, you know, you're kind of setting up. If you have the boost energy, you're already putting so much into this Pokemon that if you do all this, Terra, and then somehow go down because of, again, bulky physical attacker or some kind of priority move, or if you like Terra Ghost into a Sucker Punch, which is probably why you don't want to go Terra Ghost, then you just lost everything on the investment. This still preserves potential booster energy, and also just kind of keeps it as an obvious choice that if you're in a winning position, or if you're on the cusp of a winning position, Terra into Fairy at +2 Calm Minds, now you're in the winning position. You hit someone with Draining Kiss, they get one shot, you get like pretty much all your health back. Actually, in most cases, you get all of your health back because your base hit points are so low. So one-shotting a Pokemon that has like 80 base hit points, depending on their investment, means that you're actually going to be getting a large amount of your health pool back. And because your special defense is so high, getting even higher because of the Calm Mind, they're not going to be able to do more damage than you're healing off the Draining Kiss. So that's kind of the situation you're trying to get yourself into. Problem, your defense is low, and like, you can't do anything like this. Like, if you're doing this, you're playing the game wrong. You're still getting one shot by physical Pokemon, even if you go full EV investment into the 55-55. So that kind of shows something weird going on with the Paradox forms, is that they're missing something. You don't have Will-O-Wisp on the Flutter Mane. If you had that, the options get wild, and fortunately we don't have to worry about that kind of stuff on what happens if you outspeed a physical attacker, you cut their attack in half, then what defense range plus hit points with speed into special attack, Draining Kiss, Calm Mind, we don't have to worry about it, is the idea. But it kind of shows, like, the theory as to, yes, this Pokemon is so heavily exploited by physical that, in theory, from a game design standpoint, you're technically allowed to do this. It doesn't mean you should, and it doesn't mean that it actually created a balanced Pokemon, but it means, like, this Pokemon has enough ways of getting so dumpstered and exploited that it could easily be like a 3-0 or 6-0 sweeping Pokemon, but it could also be completely useless into certain opponent compositions. But then that just kind of shows the obvious. If you have hard defensive Pokemon on your team, something that can switch in and recover, switch in and set up Iron Defense or something, maybe switch in, go for an Amnesia on its natural physical bulk. We've seen like a lot of stuff around that. It complements the Flutter Mane. So the second your opponent's last physical Pokemon goes down, Flutter Mane just gets to win on Calm Mind shenanigans, regardless of the item set, EV spread, or whatever. So that's kind of what you're playing for, but it also means your win condition is very obvious, and that does weaken the Flutter Mane a little bit. So if your opponent can kind of like counter and break that down, and then kind of give up everything else to remove your tanks, but preserve 1 or 2 physical Pokemon, now Flutter Mane just can't perform. As for other move options, we got some cute stuff in here like the Pain Split, but again, we don't have like enough reliable durability to pull some shenanigans. I've been seeing like Curse, Pain Split, Mimikyu for anti-tanking, but if you're like setting up Calm Minds and you're going to be going pretty strong, the Psyshock at least giving you something to do against Blissey, but there are problems with unaware Pokemon that are very common. And that kind of shows that you have to make some kind of concession on the Flutter Mane. Do you get bodied by the Dondozo, or do you get bodied by the Blissey? I mean, maybe there is a weird world where you actually give up the Shadow Ball because you're just kind of like Calm Mind moonshotting everything, and then you want the Thunderbolt to cover for Water-type bulk, and you need the Psyshock just in case that like Salt Vest Pokemon or that heavy special tank is there to ruin your day. But yeah, Pain Split doesn't feel as reliable. I think there's just better Pokemon to fill that. And then you kind of look at Terra Blast into some like alt Terra typing, but I think if you're going for like Terra type Terra Blast, there's just better Pokemon to put that on for like sweeping and stuff to round out their coverage, because like your coverage is fine. Your problem is that there's just too many Pokemon to go up against, rather than not having enough moves from your move pool to choose from. Memento maybe gets like 1% usage and some kind of like last ditch weirdness, but then again, you're just giving up coverage where a tank will now just completely roll you. So you don't want to be doing that stuff. And Nightshade is too little damage is if you're finding like the super effective or ideal special attack on a 135 special attacking Pokemon. And then to finish up the video, we can look into damage and what happens. So 135, it's a good amount of stats, but at the end of the day, it really isn't. We see this with Garchomp, we see this with other Pokemon, that if you're just running a standard attack, like a 90 base power attack with stab, even boosted, and then it's on like a 130-ish, 140-ish range, you're actually not KOing everything like you feel like you should. So that is also a vulnerability of Flutter Mane, is that even if you set it up, it's still not one-shotting everything. So it can be chipped down, it can be worn away, it can be bulked out, which is what makes the baffling ban decisions from the clowns over at Smogon even more stupid. But like, yeah, the matchups start to get weird. Now, you do have like that natural special defense that also makes it harder for opponents' Pokemon, that a Choice Specs Jolteon Shadow Ball doesn't KO you. Now, Terra Ghost Jolteon, whatever, all that other weirdness. However, the Moonblast at +1 doesn't always KO the Jolteon. Now you have all of this on crazy speed as well, so we can just see the direct power creeping of an older Pokemon, but that's only in the sweeping matchups. If Flutter Mane isn't in a sweeping matchup, it's getting bulked out, it's getting set up against, and an unaware Pokemon can also take its lunch. So considerations, you kind of want to hit that +1 sweet spot, but keep an eye on the +2s depending on what the opponent's going for, and then you need to make sure you're outspeeding everything, not getting resisted, not getting just bulked out, and also not eating any priority, or else you actually start to fall apart pretty quickly. And also, let's kind of show the last considerations for the Flutter Mane with the Sucker Punch damage calculations. So I'm just starting off with like the most generic, just filler Pokemon right here. So 95 attack, non-stab, non-boosted Sucker Punch is going to do you know, not quite a 2-hit KO on to the Flutter Mane, but as everything changes around this, if it's a stab, which generally you're going to find on Sucker Punches, then we're finding a lot of damage. If you have Choice Band +1 Life Orb, then even though it's a neutral hit, the stats are so low on the Flutter Mane, it can just go down. So Stab, Life Orb, Sucker Punch from like a 110 Pokemon with an adamant nature, that starts getting a bit more reliable on the KOs, and it only goes up from there. Also going like Dark Terra on a Dark type into a Sucker Punch, it means that like the Flutter Mane can just go into a very bad or spooky matchup, but you also don't have to one-shot this thing. That if a random just offensive Pokemon has the Sucker Punch, even non-stab, if Flutter Mane got chipped by a special attacker, worn down by anything, Flutter Mane's just kind of like, oh, my reign ends here. You can trade 1 for 1 because the opponent just brings a priority into it. And even though Scizor is the obvious choice, a lot of other Pokemon can run Bullet Punch besides Scizor, so you're going to see some things kind of break down for the Flutter Mane. I guess that kind of goes back into like, with this, you can give it Life Orb, but Flutter Mane, Calm Minding, taking a hit, that's kind of alright, but eventually like the Life Orbs start putting you in riskier and riskier scenarios, and then if the opponent has like something wild, then maybe Flutter Mane can actually be in trouble. So there are ways of dealing with this Pokemon, but there are ways of finding a path to victory through team composition and win condition understanding. So if you guys enjoy the video, hope you all have a nice day. Thank you very much for watching.